The Iron Warriors are well known for their complicated relationship with the Chaos Gods. They are not devoted to the warp entities in the same way as other corrupted legions are, and instead view Chaos as a tool to further their own ends. But Chaos always has a way of tipping the balance in their favour, and I'll be exploring this in this video as I build another supporter-submitted homebrew Chaos warband, the Scourging Hunger. But first, let's hear from the sponsors of this video, Displate. If you're watching this, then it's almost guaranteed that you're a fan of Warhammer. Well, you'd be pleased to hear that to celebrate Warhammer Day 2024, Displate has released some all-new metal posters. First up is this stunning 3-piece set featuring Titus and his Ultramarine squad mowing through Tyranid hordes. This is official Space Marine 2 art and it looks incredible, especially on Displate's new textured metal posters called Textra. But this is just the tip of the Tyranid horde, because Displate has a full new collection of Space Marine 2 art, as well as some timeless Warhammer classics, such as this beautiful rendition of Horus versus the Emperor. This is a time-limited Warhammer exclusive drop though, and is only available until the 20th of October. So just like the Death Company, if you want to relive those final moments of Sanguinius, then you better hurry. As well as featuring awesome designs, Displate posters also are super simple to mount. They don't require any hammers or drilling, instead use a quick and straightforward magnet mounting system. It's just stick and place. And because they're magnetic, I can easily refresh my decor and swap out my posters with new ones in mere seconds. And it's not just Warhammer, there are tons of designs to pick from. In the past, I've had Fallout, Bioshock, and even a Monkey Island poster, but their range also includes officially licensed posters from Star Wars, Marvel, DC, and a load more movies and video games. So, if you're looking to bring Warhammer or any other design to your walls, then check out my link or use my code to get 27% off buying 1 to 2 Displates or 33% off 3 or more, and you can find that link down in the description and comments below. So with that, let's get back to our Nurgle corrupted Iron Warrior. Created by Splinkus, the Scourging Hunger are an Iron Warriors warband who fell for the Plague God's trickery and were punished for their arrogance. Cursed with an unceasing appetite, the aptly named Scourging Hunger are now the pawns of Nurgle. To create this warband, I began with the rear half of a Mark III Space Marine torso and the front half of a Death Watch veteran torso. To join these together, I had to remove the Inquisition symbol from the chest and make a few trims around the sides. Once these have been made, the two pieces attach together surprisingly well, leaving me with a slight variation on the original Mark III style. There was still a gap where the Mark III's groin panel would have been though. This was fairly straightforward to rectify. I simply sawed away the panel from the original front torso piece, compared it against the new torso, and made a series of small changes and adjustments until the two parts were lining up. Once I was happy with the fit, the plate was glued along with the lower legs, leaving me with a good starting point for my Scourge. For the pose, I wanted to recreate this piece of artwork of the Scourging Hunger that Splinkus had commissioned, with the large mace in the right hand and the left arm being held to the side. To create the at ease left arm, I began with a shield hand taken from the Legion command sprue, and clipped away the handle parts before making further trims with my knife. The remaining section of the handle was then drilled out with my pin vise, which resulted in a hand being held in a loose fist. With the hand prepped, it was glued to another Legion Command arm, along with a Mark III wrist plate. While Splinkus had provided me with a good idea of the Scourging Hunger's appearance and background, I wanted the Nurgle aesthetic of this warband to be more industrial to represent their Iron Warriors heritage, which is what drew me to this piece of Death Guard artwork. The various pipes and spherical reservoirs are a great alternative to the fleshy entrails and pus-filled boils present on normal Nurgle-infested Marines. So, to recreate this look, I began with a Chaos shoulder pad. I picked this World Eater one because I like the trim, but it did mean that I had to shave away the symbol first. Once I had a flat surface, I used my pin vise to drill a couple of shallow divots into the surface. Into these, I superglued some variously sized ball bearings to create my spherical reservoirs. You can pick up packs of these bearings quite cheaply on Amazon, and I'll link to one that I use below. To recreate the complex, intertwining pipework, some 1mm plastic or styrene rod was used. Using my tweezers, the rods were carefully bent to form various angles. Dipping your rods into some hot water should help to avoid the pipe snapping too. With a few sections of these made, I could superglue them between the ball bearings and the shoulder pad itself in various shapes and sizes of rod. After completing the shoulder pad, this was glued to the torso, and I continued my addition of pipes and ball bearings to the rest of the armor. For the power pack, a couple of larger bearings were added in the same way. To create the appearance of an exhaust pipe, the tip of a Legion melter gun was cut away, trimmed, drilled, and then superglued to the larger ball bearing. I followed this up with more plastic rod pipes, which sprawled across the pipes and the backpack itself. My aim here was to bulk out the left side of the model to counterbalance the large mace that I would intend to attach to the right. To recreate that mace from the artwork, I would combine the mace from an Age of Sigmar Chaos Chosen alongside a banner pole taken from the Legion command set. But first, the mace needed to be clipped away from its current handle, and the tip of the banner pole needed to be flattened out too. To make the bond between the mace and the banner pole a little more secure, I added a pin. This was created by drilling a 1mm hole into both the mace and the pole before supergluing a short length of wire into one of the holes. The mace head and the pole were then superglued together, attached to the arm and then to the torso. I then finished off the mace arm with a Mark III wrist plate and shoulder pad. In a similar vein to how I used the plastic rod to mimic the twisting, dangling entrails of the Death Guard, I next decided to add some dangling cables taken from a Skitarii backpack. These were clipped away, trimmed back, and attached to the right shoulder pad. With the bulk of the model complete, I was able to focus on bulking out some of the equipment. For the chest, I filled in the remaining gap with a Death Watch pouch before attaching a few Mark III pouches around his waist. When it came to selecting a head, I narrowed things down to one of the Mark VI Death Guard heads and a helmetless World Eater head. The Death Guard head was similar enough to the Iron Warriors aesthetic to work, but I personally prefer the characterfulness of a bare head. The butcher nails on the World Eater head would also work well for the mechanical implants you'd expect to see on an Iron Warrior, and I could easily paint the skin to reflect a Nurglish influence. With the head picked, I didn't attach it, but instead created a wire holder for it. At this point, the model was complete and I could turn my attention to the base. For this, I wanted to create the appearance of a ruined paved surface, something you'd expect to see on an invaded Imperial world. To create the bricks needed to build this paved road, I first mixed up and flattened out some milliput. The putty was rolled out to roughly 2mm in thickness before being allowed to partly cure for a few hours. Once it was slightly firmer, I cut the putty into narrow strips of roughly 3mm width, which were then further cut down into 5mm chunks, although some variations in size can be quite useful. From here, the bricks were left to fully cure overnight. At which point, I was able to rough up the edges a little with my knife before gluing them to the base in a typical staggered pattern. To break up the base a little, and to give it more of a 40k vibe, I laid down a few different thicknesses of plastic rod between two of the rows before I continued laying the bricks. Finally, to create an impression of damage, a few of my usual lumps of torn up cork floor tile were glued into place. Finally, I filled out the remaining gaps in the base with some AK Dark Earth. By wiping off the excess with a damp cloth, the paste created the appearance of mortar between the bricks. I didn't attach the Marine to the base just yet though, and instead attached him to a temporary base with a small dab of superglue. At which point I could begin the painting. And if you haven't done so already, please do consider giving this video a like and hitting the subscribe button if you're enjoying this video so far. It really helps me out and helps to keep you up to date for any future videos that I release. To start the painting, I began with a black primer, and it doesn't really matter how you apply it either. Rattle can or airbrush will give you just as good results. With the primer in place, I could start to build up some colour. I started with the most dominant colour of the model, which of course was the armour. For this, I picked some Battle Axe brass from the Tooth and Coats range. This light bronze colour is the perfect starting point for representing the armour of the Scourging Hunger. To save time, I applied this paint via my airbrush, but a regular brush application would have worked here as well. I steadily built up the layers until I was left with a good, solid, starting metallic colour. As I wanted the armour to lie somewhere between the metallics of the Iron Warriors and the green armour of the Death Guard, my next step saw me add a layer of thinned Mantis Warriors green contrast paint. By mixing in some airbrush thinner, I heavily reduced the mix's viscosity, which essentially turned it into a wash. This was then applied across the armour, where it was allowed to pool and form around those recesses, and give the armour a slightly green hue. Using a similarly thinned mixture of Cygor Brown, I then worked on darkening down a few of the recesses, whilst also painting on some thin lines of grime. I had these emanating from a seam or a bolt and run vertically down the armour to create the impression of streaks of rust and grime. Even though the Scourging Hunger have fallen to Nurgle, they still retain the hazard stripes of their Iron Warrior origins across their right shoulder pad and left leg. However, to add a little variation, I did only paint the yellow stripes, leaving the bronze armour visible where the black stripes would normally be. It might sound a little pretentious, but I feel that this symbolises the intertwining of the Iron Warrior's origins with their new Nurgle master. To paint these strips, I carefully freehanded some dark sun yellow. I thinned out my paint a little to this too. You're looking for a consistency that flows easily off the brush but doesn't spread out further than where you've applied it. After the initial layer, I continue to build up the intensity of the yellow with an extra 1 or 2 coats of paint as required. To help the yellow lines to stand out even further, I then applied a thin line of the lighter Craven Yellow along the top edge of each of the darker yellow bands. A few more streaks of Cygor Brown were then painted across the yellow areas that I painted in the previous steps. Now that the base colour of the armour was in place, I could start to work on painting the remaining metallic details, specifically the steel areas such as the mace and the various pipes and reservoirs across the armour. For all of these, I went with the dark silver of Dwarven Iron. To bring in the typical Nurgle rust effects, I took some rust orange and heavily diluted it with some airbrush thinner to create a wash-like consistency. This was then applied across all of the areas that I painted with rust orange. The low viscosity caused the mix to flow into the recesses, and once it dried, it left behind the opaque orange, which created the impression of spots of rust. These details were then darkened down slightly with another coat of Cygor Brown wash. From here, I could then start to highlight both the armour and the rust metallics. For both of these areas, I used the same paint, so coat silver, and used it to pick out all of the edges. By creating a lighter silver edge, it helped to contrast against the darker surfaces around them. These highlights were then pushed even further with a few small spots of Mythril Blade, which were focused onto just the sharpest details such as the corners, spikes and rivets. This was my extreme highlight. By this point, I was able to move away from the metallics and start to paint all of the pouches, a few of the pipes, and the gaps between the armour. These were all base coated with the same Doom Death Black. These areas were then followed up with an initial highlight of Dungeon Stone Grey, followed by a few small spots of Wizard Grey for the extreme highlight. My next area of focus was the head. I wanted to create a pale, pallid skin tone, so started out with a base coat of Dwarven Skin. As I was painting over the black base coat, it did require a couple of layers to achieve a good, solid starting point. Over the top of this, the skin was given a wash of Magi purple. This started to give the flesh the impression of bruising and necrosis, whilst also darkening down some of the recesses. After allowing the wash to dry, I then began the highlights. The first of these was Elven Skin, and this was used to pick out the facial features, whilst leaving the darker purple toned skin still visible in those recesses. This was followed up with the even paler Ivory Tusk to create the lightest points of the pallid tone I was looking to create. But the skin wasn't quite done yet. After whipping up another thinned batch of contrast paint, this time Volupus Pink, I then started to apply this around the eyes, mouth and cybernetics. This stained the surfaces and gave the flesh a raw, infected look. I then finished this up with a very few small patches of Mantis Warrior's Green, once again thinned down. I speckled this around points of the face and emanating from the mouth. This green tone simply helped to push that infected by Nurgle effect just a bit further. With the model itself painted, I was able to shift my attention to the base. Here, I began by dry brushing the bricks and rubble with some Fury Green. I slightly dampened my dry brush, laid out my paint onto a texture palette, and then worked a small amount of the paint through the bristles. With the brush prepped, I used a combination of circular strokes and stippling to give the base a muddy green tone. This green hue was just the start though, and was followed by a lighter dry brush of Wizard Grey, which helped me to pick out the edges of the bricks and the rubble. Even more lightly than before, some Carcharadon Grey was then applied so just the most prominent details were picked out, leaving me with the appearance of some slightly mossy bricks. For the pipes, I simply repeated the same steps that I'd used to paint the mace earlier on, and then applied a few small spots of Mantis Warrior's Green to really push that mossy effect even further. With everything painted, all that was left to do now was to remove the wire holders, scrape clean the contact points, and glue everything together. All before sealing in the paintwork with a quick coat of matte varnish, and with that final step, I was left with this. And so that concludes another one of my supporter submitted builds. A big thank you to you, Splinkus, for submitting your idea. It was really great to work on another custom Chaos Warband, and working out how to create something that was recognizable as both an Iron Warrior and being corrupted by Nurgle was an interesting challenge. It would have been very easy to lean too much in either direction, and just end up with a Silver Death Guard or a Green Iron Warrior, but I think that I managed to just about tread that fine line. Now, I didn't really get to touch on it much in the rest of the video, but the name of the Scourging Hunger comes from their insatiable appetite, a punishment bestowed on them for trying to defy the Chaos Gods. While Splinkus saw this manifest as a need to consume flesh, I decided to go in a slightly different way of how this is manifested on the model. Rather than food, it's a need to consume energy. Nurgle is, after all, entropy. So a few enterprising Chaos Marines have realised that an energy source satiates their hunger, and so have fitted their armour with Promethean reservoirs, bioreactors and even crude fusion devices, all to stave off their overwhelming need to eat and allow them to focus their broken, yet still analytical minds to their battlefield goals. And once again, a big thank you to Displate for sponsoring this video. Remember to check out my link or use my code to get 27% off buying 1 to 2 Displates or 33% off 3 or more. Now, if you too would like to create the Scourging Hunger, then you can find all the parts and paint I used to build it linked in the description below. And if you're a supporter of the channel and you'd like to be in for a chance to have me build and send you a model of your own custom faction, then you can find all the relevant submission links below. Speaking of my Patreon supporters and channel members, a big thank you to everyone who continues to help keep this channel going. And if you'd like to support me too, you can get early access to ad-free videos, exclusive merchandise, and even your name in the credits. Simply follow my Patreon link below or hit the join button. Just like my pouch of dead animal bits and above Patreon supporters did, who are Axel Jonsson, Berserker, Bits of Wargaming, Chris Reynolds, Daniel Dowling, Gabe Benavides, Immaterial Creations, Maciej Savitsky, Morgan, Mr. Grimm, Nima, Pale Juice, Ryan Little, Splinkus, Swedsman, Tim, Tom Haysmith, and War Novice. And my Sergeant level channel members who are Alex Verne, Omnitom, Kutch Kato, S.O., Phoenix's Den, Lloyd Davies, Trooper Geo, David, John Gibbs, The Sire Acquired, Nerdington Bates, Mark Taylor, Whale Tussler, and Philip Poya. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.